guys to my YouTube channel Make in NCRT. So today we are going to study the fourth chapter of class 6 history NCRT book. The name of the chapter is What Books and Burials Tell Us. So let us start. Mary in the library. As the bell rang, the teacher asked the students to follow him because they were going to the library for the first time. When Mary stepped inside, she found that the library was larger than their classroom, and there were so many shelves, all full of books. In one corner was a cupboard filled with large old volumes. After trying to open the cupboard, the teacher said, "That cupboard has very special books on different religions. Did you know that we have a set of Vedas?" What are the Vedas? Mary wondered. Let us find out. So, as we can see that in this small story, Mary, she is a school student and she is going to the library for the first time. She is amazed to see how big the library, how many books it contains. She notices a special shelf where there are quite big volumes of books. So they explain, and there is a set of the Vedas. So here there is a question that what are the Vedas? Find out about them in this chapter. Let's continue. One of the the oldest Veda is the Rig Veda, composed about 2500 here it talks about the fourth type of The Rig includes more than 1,000 hymns called sukta or well said. These hymns are in praise of various gods and goddesses. Three gods are especially important: Agni, the god of fire; Indra, the warrior god; and Soma. See here that the word Sukta means well said. And these hymns in the Rig Veda are for various gods and goddesses, but among them, three important gods are known as Agni, the god of fire; Indra, the warrior god; and Soma, which is a plant from which a special drink is made. It it is a type of hallucinogenic drink that was made, this Soma. Next, these hymns were composed by sages, that is, sages means rishis. These priests taught students to recite and memorize each syllable, word, and sentence bit by bit with great care. Most of the hymns were composed, taught, and learned by men. A few were composed by women. So we can see here that the sages or rishis, they composed all these hymns in the Vedas, and these rishis, they taught their students very carefully. They taught them each word, syllable, and every little details, with very utmost care. And most of the hymns were composed by men, but we see that some of the hymns were also composed by women. Next, the Rig Veda is in Old or Vedic Sanskrit, which is different from Sanskrit you learn in school these days. So we see that this Rig Veda was written in using the old or the Vedic Sanskrit. Now this form of Sanskrit is different from the Sanskrit that we use nowadays, and it was this type of Sanskrit has a lot of similarities to the original Indo-European languages. We will learn about this in the coming chapters. So let us continue. We can see that here in the blue box, it explains Sanskrit and other languages. Sanskrit is part of the family of languages known as Indo-European. Some Indian languages such as Assamese, Gujarati, Hindi, Kashmiri, and Sindhi, and languages such as Persian and many European languages, English such as English, French, German, Greek, Italian, and Spanish, belong to the group of this family. They are called a family because they originally had words in common. So we see that Sanskrit and many other languages such as Persian, Greek, English, French, German, all these are part of a big group of language known as a language family. This language family is known as the Indo-European languages. So next we see, take the words matra in Sanskrit and ma in Hindi and mother in English. Do you notice any similarities? Other languages used in the subcontinent belong to different families. For instance, those used in the northeast belong to the Tibeto-Burman family. Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam belong to the Dravidian family, and the languages spoken in Jharkhand and parts of central India belong to the Austroasiatic family. See that other than primarily the Tibeto-Burman language group, then in the south languages belong to the Austroasiatic family. Uh, so if we go back and see this question that do you notice any similarities in the words matra in Sanskrit, ma in Hindi, and mother in English, we could see that all three of these sound quite similar. So this is a way in which linguists they try connection between these kinds of words and create a connection between these seemingly different languages. They try to trace their origin back to the Indo-European language and to the original language from which all the different languages slowly differentiated. So let's continue. The books we use are written and printed. The Rig Veda was recited and heard rather than read. It was written down several centuries later after it was first composed and printed less than 200 years ago. So we see here that the Rig Veda was primarily used in the spoken way. That is, it was heard and memorized by the students from their masters, and then they taught their students and so on. And it was much later that we see that handwritten copies of the Rig Veda and other religious scriptures began to show up, and even at a later date, that is perhaps less than 200 years ago, we find the first printed copies of the Vedas. So let's continue. How historians study the Rig Veda. Historians like archaeologists find out about the past, but in addition to material remains, they examine written sources as well. Let us see how they study the Rig Veda. So we can see that archaeologists, like historians, both of them alike, they try to find out different material sources from excavations and digs, and also several manuscripts and written sources. So let us see how they have studied the Rig Veda. Some of the hymns in the Rig Veda are in a form of dialogue. This is part of one such hymn, a dialogue between a sage called Vishwamitra and two rivers, Bias and Satlej, that were worshipped as goddesses. So we see that the hymns of the Rig Veda are in the form of dialogue between two entities. And in the given example, we see that the sage called Vishwamitra is having a dialogue with two sacred rivers, that is the Bias and the Satlej. So let's continue. If we see this picture, we can see that a page from a manuscript of the Rig Veda. This manuscript of the Rig Veda on a birch bark was found in Kashmir. About 150 years ago, it was used to prepare one of the earliest printed texts of the Rig Veda, as well as an English translation. It is now preserved in a library in Pune, Maharashtra. So we see that earlier, when printing did not exist, and when the first copies of the Rig Veda were being handwritten, so it was written down in these type of birch bark or palm leaves. So this is one of the earliest copies that we have in existence. So it was first used to create the first printed edition of the Rig Veda, and also a English translated version of it. So let's continue. Here in this box, we learn about the dialogue between Vishwamitra and the rivers. Um, we can read it, or I will just skip this part, because if you want, you can go ahead and read all the dialogues. We will just go to the next part. This one is not that important, but if you are interested, you can read it. So let's continue. The next part is cattle, horses, and chariots. There are many prayers in the Rig Veda for cattle, children, especially sons, and horses. Horses were yoked to chariots that were used in battles, which were fought to capture cattle. So we see that the prayers in the Rig Veda are primarily focused on cattle, children that is to have a son, and horses. So we see that the horses in that time were to draw the chariots. Cattle. Now, cattle was a primary source of wealth and power, prestige in those times, and whoever controlled the more cattle usually had the more power. So, to survive, so people fought over them naturally. Some of the wealth that was obtained was kept by the leaders, and some was given, and the rest was distributed amongst the people. So we see that after the war, the wealth that was taken by the victors was mainly kept by the that is the leader, ruler, and then some part was given to the priest who and the sages, and the rest was distributed amongst the people. Some of the wealth was used for the performance of yajnas, or sacrifices in which offerings were made into the fire. So we see yajna role in the socio-religious life. Sacrifices during this the from the cattle, cows, milk, and grain was offered, and in some cases took part in these wars, where met and discussed matters of war and peace, often brave and skillful warriors. Did not exist in this time, and but to resolve the disputes that arose, we see that there are several bodies. There is a discuss the issue and resolve the problem. They usually selected a leader among themselves, and this leader was usually a great warrior or a skillful warrior. So let's continue. Words to describe people. There are several ways of describing people in terms of the work they do, the language they speak, and the place they belong to, family, their communities, their practices. Some of the words found in the naturally we see here the in terms of their works. These are the priests. Sometimes they are called as the rituals and the rajas. So are the Brahmins and the rajas. The Brahmins were the priests who performed the sacrifices, did offerings to the gods and goddesses, and the rajas who were the rulers and the leaders of their communities. These rajas were not like the ones you will learn about later, but they did not taxes. One thing we notice here is that the position of Raja was not a head during this time. Read the previous section once more and see whether you find out what the Rajas did. So, in this question, we see that if we look at the previous section, we read that Rajas, these people were the leaders of their community. So, as we read here, that the leaders that were elected were generally brave and skillful warriors. So, their role in the society was generally to lead the people during the war and and so on. So let's continue. Two words were used to describe the people or the community. Reference to the Puru Jana or wish, the Bharata Jana or wish, and the Yadu Jana and that in the Rigveda, uh, these words are the from wish. And during the Rigvedic time, we see that several different janas or wish existed. Now, these were basically tribes or groups of people that were living together. So, few of these janas or wish are such as the Puru, the Bharata, and the Yadu tribes or jana or wish. Do any of these names sound familiar? So if we have read the Mahabharata, we should know that we should have heard about the Puru, the Bharata, and the Yadu. So all these you can see there are several references to these tribes in the ancient Hindu scriptures, the Rig Veda, and so on. So let's continue. Sometimes the people who compose these hymns describe themselves as Aryans and called their opponents the Dasas or the Shus. These people did not perform sacrifices and probably spoke different languages. So we see that themselves as the Aryans and they refer to the other group of people who they did not consider as Aryans because these people did not perform sacrifices and different language which the Aryans did not understand. So the Aryans called these peoples the Dasas or the Jews. Let's continue. Later, the term Dasa and the feminine of it, Dasi, came to mean a slave. Slaves were women and men who were often captured in war. They were treated as property of their owners who could make them do whatever the work they wanted. So we see that the word dasa it at later date into a word for the slaves. While Ayurveda was being in the northwest of the subcontinent, there were other sentinels, the story of the megaliths. Look at the illustration. These stone boulders are known as megaliths, literally big stones. So, as we saw in one of the previous chapters, that liths is generally translated to related to stones, and mega, as you know, very big. Burial people are buried. Practically, megaliths years ago and was prevalent throughout the Deccan, South India, and in Northeast and Kashmir. So we see that in these places, in the Deccan, in South India, in Northeast, and in the Kashmir, now in this picture we can see that there is a grave in the center, and big stones are arranged in a circular pattern around it. So these are the megaliths. This type of megalith is known as a cyst. So this type of megalith is called a cyst. Some cysts, like the one shown here, have portholes which could have been used as an entrance. So we see that these type of burial pits are known as a cyst, and some of these also contained a porthole which were used for. So some important megalithic sites are shown on map 2. Burial that is underground. Now let's see here. There were several things that people did to make megaliths. We have made a list here. Try and arrange them in the correct order. Digging pits in the earth, transporting stones, breaking boulders, placing stones in the position, finding suitable stones, shaping stones, and burying the dead. It is in a proper breaking the boulders. They would need a stone to make the megaliths, and then transportation of the stones. Then it would be, oh no, sorry. The first would be the finding the suitable stone. Then it would be the breaking boulders and shaping the stones, and transportation of the stones, and placing the stones in position. Now, after we have placed all the stones in a circle, or just a single stone, we could dig the pits in the earth, and then bury the dead. All these burials have some common features. Generally, the dead were buried with distinctive pots, which are called black and red ware. Also found are tools and weapons of iron, and sometimes skeletons of horses. So we see here that the black or red soil. Also found remains and equipment were also found. Sometimes more objects are found in one grave than one skeleton was buried with 33 gold beads and 2 stone beads and 4 copper bangles and 1 conch shell. So if we see Brahmagiri, it's a place we have to look at map 2. So if you look at map 2 in this book, it is at located at page number 12. You could see a spot that is marked as Brahmagiri. So at this spot, a skeleton was found that contained 33 gold beads, 2 stone beads, 4 copper bangles, and 1 conch shell. Other skeletons have only a few pots. These suggest that there was some difference in status amongst the people who were buried. Some were rich, some others were poor, some chiefs and others followers. So we see that the type of burial, it indicated the social status of a person. Now, if a person is buried with, let's say, a lot of jewels and ornaments and many other pots and pans, this indicates that the person usually belong to the higher class of a society. And if the burial chamber is quite simple and doesn't contain a lot of things, then it could be inferred that the person who is buried usually was a commoner. So the next part here talks about where some burial spot meant for certain families. Sometimes megaliths contain more than one skeleton. These indicate that people, perhaps belonging to the same family, were buried in the same place, though not at the same time. The bodies of those who have died later were brought into the grave through the portholes. Stone circles or boulders were placed on the surface, probably served as signposts to find the burial site, so that people could return to the same place whenever they wanted to. So we see that here it explains the use of the megaliths, as why the megaliths were placed on top of a burial site. And we also read about some of the megalithic burials containing portholes. So the use of the portholes, basically the one grave could also contain more than one skeleton. So these were sort of family graves that were used for different generation of the family. So after one person is buried, at a later day when another member dies, the people could bring the body to the same spot and bury it with their other family members. So as a way to mark this spot, they used to place all these stones that are the megaliths on top of the burial site. And to enter the burial chamber, that's why we see the presence of portholes. Now these served as entrances inside the burial chamber. Let's continue. Special burial at Imangao. Now again we have to look at Imangao. If you guys look at Imangao on map 2 on page number 12, it is a site on the river Ghod, a tributary of river Bhima. It was occupied between 3600 to 2700 years ago. Here adults are generally buried in the ground, laid out straight, with the heads towards the north. Sometimes burials were within the houses. Vessels that probably contained food and water were placed with the dead. So we see that in the case of Imangao, it is located beside the river God, which is a tributary of Bhima, and the date of occupation of this site is around from here a peculiar type of burial is found that the adults direction. Sometimes were also found with houses of the people. Vessels containing food were placed inside the burial chamber. So these served as probably a food for the life after death. There was some sort of belief, and thus the food and offerings were placed inside the grave. One man was found buried in a large four-legged clay jar in a courtyard of a five-room house, one of the largest house in the site. In the center of the settlement, this house also had a granary. The body was placed in a cross-legged position. So we see that in the same settlement, peculiar a burial is found that a man who was placed in a cross-legged position, and his body was then placed inside a large clay jar, that is a four-legged clay jar, and the house where this burial was found, it was one of the largest house in the Imangao site, and it also contained a granary. Now, as we know, granary is a place where grains are stored for using them at a later date. Grains are harvested and then they are stored at a granary, and when it is needed, the grains are used at a later date. So for this side, we see that this is a uh, interesting point for burials that we found in the Mangao. We also see that the sitting or placing someone in the cross-legged position is still used, quite prevalent in the Indian culture. So the roots of all these different practices go back to these old megalithic sites. Uh, Do you think that this was the body of a chief? Give the reasons for your answer. So, if you look at the body that was found, say, in a cross-legged position, the body was found in the biggest house of the site, which was located in the center of the settlement. And this house also contained a granary. So we could infer that the people living in this house were probably of importance in the society of this settlement, and this could have been the chief of the Imangao settlement. So let's continue. Next, we have a blue box. This box talks about what skeletal studies tell us. It is easy to make out the skeleton of a child from its small size. However, there are no major differences in the bones of a girl and a boy. Can we make out whatever a skeleton was that a man or a woman? Sometimes people decide this on the basis of what is found with the skeleton. For instance, if a skeleton is found with jewelry, it is sometimes thought to be of a woman. However, there are problems with this. Often men also wore ornaments. So we see that when bodies are found inside a burial site, if it belongs to a child, then it could be easily identified due to its small size. Otherwise, if the body is of a normal human being, then owing to quite similar bone structure in both male and female, it is difficult to identify whether it is a man or a woman. So archaeologists then take help of the things that are found inside the burial chamber. Now, if in case there is a lot of jewelry that is found, one can say that the body belonged to a woman. But with this approach, there is a problem that during those times as well as today, we see that men also wear jewelry, and ornaments made of, say, let's say, precious metals or stones were quite often worn by the chiefs of a society, who were generally men. So there is a problem with this approach of identifying the bodies. So let's see. A better way of figuring out the sex of a skeleton is to look at the bone structure. The hip or the pelvic area of a woman is generally larger to an is just from little studies. See that whether a skeleton is a male or female is to look at its bone structure. Uh, enables us to distinguish a skeleton from that is if it is a male or a female. These distinctions that we see are based on modern scientific studies. About 2000 years ago, there was a famous physician named Charaka who wrote a book of medicine known as the Charaka Samhita. There he states that the human body has 360 bones, which is a much larger number than the 200 bones that are recognized, excuse me, in the 200 bones that are recognized in modern anatomy. Charaka arrived at this figure by counting the teeth, joints, and cartilage. So we see that there was one ancient physician of the by the name of Charaka. He wrote a famous book on medicine no, that is known as the Charaka Samhita. Now this is quite important. In this book, he estimated the number of bones in the human body to be 360, but today we know that it is 200 bones. Actually, he had counted the teeth and the different cartilage and ligaments and joints in the human body to arrive at such a large number. Then there is a question that do you think he found out about the human body uh, in great detail? How do you so we see that for Charaka to or for the structure and the human body and the amount of number of continue occupations at Imangao. Archaeologists have found seeds of wheat, barley, rice, pulses, millets, and sesame, bones of a number of animals, many bearing cut marks that show that they may have been used as food, have also been found. These include cattle, buffalo, goat, sheep, dog, horses, ass, pig, sambar, spotted deer, black buck, antelope, hare, mongoose, beside bird, crocodile, turtle, crab, fish. This is evidence that fruits such as bur, amla, jamun, dates, and a variety of berries were also collected. Settlement at Imangao, people ate various kinds of food. They consumed seeds such as pulses such as wheat, barley, rice, millets, and so on, and also they eat and they also consumed different types of fruits and vegetables like amla, jamuns, and so on. chariot that we see is more in those bullocks or cattle. Sacrifice, we talked about the yajnas. These sacrifices or fire sacrifices were done for various religions. Now, Raja is of Rigvedic times. The slave that we saw was the word for dasa or dasi, these slaves. Then the megaliths are the large stones that were used to mark the burial spots. Then a burial is a place where a people or skeleton is the then iron, it is the primary metal. Now dates. So the beginning of the composition of Vedas was about 3,500 years ago, and the beginning of the megaliths was around 3,000 years ago. Settlement at Imangao was between from 3,600 to 2,700 years ago, and Charaka, who wrote the Charaka Samhita, was about 2,000 years ago. So now we come at the end of the chapter, guys. Hope you enjoyed the explanation. If you have any suggestions to for improvement or any doubt, you can write them in the comment section. So if this was any help to you, do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and I will meet you in the next chapter. Take care.